Hello and welcome to this webinar on understanding mental health first aid. I am Lisa Jaskula, Child Development Specialist, and I will be your host today. So before we start, I would like to head to the definitions of mental health and mental ill health. However, I would like to ask you first how you would define mental health as it relates to students and staff in your setting or in any educational setting. If we just reflect, what does mental health mean and what does mental ill health mean? If you would like to share in the chat box, that would be wonderful. Or anyone who's watching the recording, just to really reflect and think about, what does this mean? Yeah, general well-being that allows you to function and perform everyday tasks and to the best of your ability. I think that sums up nicely. So let's go to the definitions page and look at what mental health means. Mental health is the state of an individual's well-being in which they can be resilient and cope well with the stresses of life, just like you wrote in there. It includes one's emotional, psychological, behavioral, relational, and social well-being. So there are quite a few layers, which we will be visiting in this whole presentation as well. And then we have mental ill health, which is the state of being unwell, which causes an individual to cope less with everyday stresses. This is considered to affect people psychologically, emotionally, and mentally, and the behaviors can also be impacted. And if we just reflect personally, when we felt mentally balanced at work or in life, feeling fulfilled, what were the factors that contributed to that? It's always important to think about what actually helps us being well, mentally and physically. If we could just reflect on that. And then nowadays, everyone talks about mindfulness, doing breathing exercises, but we're all not the same. And there's some factors that actually contribute more than others. And we're all different. Support from others around me, being able to talk, feeling of belonging. Yes, I can really relate to this, to be honest. I'm very much the same. I get a lot out from other people, the support, being understood, feeling heard, and not alone in the difficulties as well, right? And sometimes it helps to just talk or vent. Yeah, I agree. It makes all the difference. So when we move on to the continuum of mental health. Oh no. The screen back on?
Yeah.
Oh, yours is on. Okay, mine went. Okay, so we all fall somewhere on the mental health continuum. Okay, we can go from excelling into crisis. It can happen to any of us. There are 5 stages where we're excelling and thriving. Then we might go down to surviving if the stresses come into our lives, to struggling, or into crisis. It'd be kind of good to write where you are, just for you personally. You don't have to share at all, but just to think, where do you think you are at the moment on the continuum of mental health? You know, when we're excelling, we can just like dream up ideas. We can do whatever we want to do. We feel powerful. We're in charge of our lives, thriving as well. You know, like just a little bit of self-care will keep us in that level. When we go to surviving, that's when we start needing to have our family support, you know, alongside our self-care routines. And when you get to struggling or in crisis, I think that's when you need to start looking towards getting professional help. So when you think about some of the students you work with or some of the colleagues, you know, what stresses would be the ones contributing to the different levels of being in the continuum? I think that's really important to think about, where, you know, we can kind of like go up and down on the continuum as well. When we think about our colleagues and when we want to look after our mental health and each other's mental health, what would be something that would send someone from surviving into struggling? You know, we can all have our everyday stresses where we are just, you know, going through with it and keep going and keep going. We can feel exhausted and tired. But what could be something that tips you over the edge and then sends you into struggling? It's really important to think about that and how we can support each other and how we communicate it within a workplace as well. So here's a little bit more detail on what the different stages look like. So again, if you find yourself in these areas in crisis and struggling, it's important to find some professional help. And in most work settings, it would be recommended to have a mental health first aider, to have someone there who is specially trained to notice the different signs. So when you are in crisis, you'd be very anxious, very low mood, don't turn up to work or be late, you know, like being very, very unpredictable in their behaviors, exhausted, poor sleep, weight loss, or weight gain as well, actually. So it could be the two of them. When you're struggling, you know, you're anxious, depressed, and your work performance is not the same. Your concentration might suffer, and it's just important to notice all these different levels and actually not judge yourself and really ask for help in those moments. So let me just see. Let me just, so you can't see what number slides they are when you're presenting. So when we're heading to the next slide, I have a few scenarios. Not for this one yet. However, when you look at the increases of what mental health what increases the risk of mental health, I'm stumbling over my words now, is social isolation, loneliness, poverty, exposure to long-term stress, job loss, unemployment, and abuse. And when we think about who we have in our educational settings and how we deal with some of the behaviors, like social isolation, you know, bullying comes into it. Children, young people being bullied, they experience social isolation. That will impact their mental health. Other children, if they show up with difficult behaviors, they get sent into isolation booths. It's important to think about how we actually handle isolation booths, not to increase the mental health struggle even more. Poverty, you know, in a lot of schools that we go into, we see a lot of poverty that will add stressors. The children will carry the stressors that the parents carry. Exposure to long-term stress, teachers teachers have a huge amount of stress, a huge amount of responsibility that they just carry around. The expectations are so high to just, deliver the best lessons, to be the social worker, to be the psychologist, to be the, attachment figure. Just there's so many levels. It is extremely stressful. And, how do we recognize that in the education settings that we work in? Then obviously job loss, unemployment, and abuse. So when you think about your own role, what are some unique stresses that you face, and how might it differ to, you and the students that you work with? I would like you to really reflect and think about that. You're welcome to share. You're welcome to just sit for a moment and really think about the children and the staff where you've seen a change in behavior, or you've seen difficulties. What might be the stresses that they're having in their lives? So at Yascola Mentoring, we often work with children that are at risk of exclusion. So they're often already not in their class environment anymore. And that is social isolation that will do something with the children. They carry something, they carry a narrative within them, that they're not accepted in the group. And how do we hold those as professionals? How do we support children that they still feel part of a group? How do we support each other with the extreme behaviors that we are faced? These are the long-term stresses. How do we show up for the children living in extreme poverty? How do we show up for the parents in our care as well? How do we show up if they've gone through job loss, unemployment, the stresses that they carry? Do we give space? Are there procedures that we can create to offer families and other professionals a space to offload, to share? I mean, it's just reflecting, how can we create a space of belonging, wherever we are with each other. Right, we'll move on to the next slide. So types of mental ill health. So when we think about the continuum, they come in varying different degrees. We start at mood disorders like anxiety and depression, then severe anxiety disorders that stop you from functioning, eating disorders that will actually impact your physical health, and psychosis where reality seems, impossible to reach. So when you think about some of the common behaviors that might align with these typical areas, what specific types of mental ill health have you observed in your students? If you think about behaviors and how could they be connected to the different areas, or with your colleagues? And how could these different symptoms manifest in your school setting? Really think about how the atmosphere would be, what would be the atmosphere in the setting where you have a high level of anxiety, high level of depression, and what can we do to actually reduce these symptoms? I think that goes back to the sense of belonging, safety, a sense of felt safety. Sorry, I just noticed. So lack of space at home to do homework, not having a person at home who has time for them, not having the same items as peers, costs. Absolutely, I agree. that will definitely impact a lot of children, you know, where the support network is lacking. So what can we do? What can we offer in the education setting? Again, can we offer homework club? Can we offer, you know, a space where children are supported differently if it can't happen at home? You know, if parents are busy, either, you know, because they're mentally worried and occupied because they need to, you know, see how they are surviving. And how can we reduce the comparison between peers? It's again, like, how can we create a culture of acceptance and, you know, reduce the judgment amongst peers? Yeah, I think that's all really, really valid. Moving on to the 4 types of mental health. Again, a little bit more in detail. I'm happy to share the slides afterwards because it's a lot of information right now. So just check. I would like to do some myth busting right now. I have some myths, some facts. Let's see where they get us. Let's start with this one. Students with mental health issues will disrupt the classroom and interfere with learning for others. True or false? And what are your thoughts? It depends on the child. Exactly. It depends on the mental health issue, right? Because if you have depression, you're not going to disrupt the classroom necessarily. If you have low level anxiety, you're also not going to disrupt the classroom. If you have a eating disorder, you're not going to disrupt the classroom necessarily. So it's really thinking about that and also taking the judgment away and the stigma away from mental health. Most won't want to be noticed. Yes, that's right. Yeah, they don't. We're just like masking. We put the mask on, put a brave face on, and keep going in and just doing our thing. Absolutely. Let's see. Let's have another one. High achieving students are less likely to experience mental health issues. True or false? Yeah, absolutely false. I mean, I suppose we all kind of know that, you know, there's the pressure of perfectionism, getting it right. Anxiety is part of it or can be part of the package. And if they don't perform to the highest standards, they can also, you know, be affected by depression. Mental health issues are rare among young children and primarily affect teenagers and adults. Yes, there is many myths here. Maybe I should just share some facts instead of just myths. But yes, that's right. So yeah, young children also suffer from mental health issues. But unfortunately, often their behaviors are just being seen as naughty, not being recognized as a mental health issue and a struggle. So I think that's a bit more complex to be noticed. And I think, yes, it's right. As teenagers, we acknowledge more that there might be anxiety or depression or anything like that. Right. While some stress is a normal part of life, clinical anxiety is different. Anxiety disorders involve persistent excessive worry and physical symptoms that interfere with daily life, requiring understanding and, in many cases, professional support. True or false? Yes. So how often do we have children and young people here that they need to toughen up, just pull yourself together, You know, just you can go through it. You know, every cloud has a silver lining. Well, that is also true sometimes, but in other cases, we do need the professional help. So I have quite a few more myths here, but I don't think we need to go through all of them. It's just interesting to really think about how many myths are we faced with on a daily basis. You know, what stigma is still around, what judgments are still around in society, in schools, and what can we do better to change that mindset, to change the attitude towards it, and what can we actually implement in our everyday school life to support children and their mental health and the staff. You know, very important. So, talking about stigma, what other stigmas do you think might still be around in schools? Oops. Yeah, that students need to just be more resilient. That's a good one. That's a skill to be learned. So schools are good places to learn things. So we've got to teach resilience there. How do we build resilience, and where do we need to start thinking about, you know, introducing the topic of resilience? Do we start early on, you know, even as early as nursery? How do we build those skills? The exams are the way forward. Yes, there's so much more to a human being than being able to do well in exams. Yes, and that actually leads me to the next question I had, but I think that's the question answered, of like what might be the pressures of school life that exacerbate certain mental health problems. I think exam pressure is one of them, that just increases the mental health difficulties. Don't know, like if you have any other ideas of what else could, you know, increase the mental health struggle. Share away, and how we could support students when they're faced with them. You know, like exam pressures, what can we do to really take the pressure off? I suppose it's that thing of communicating that exams are not the only way forward. How to work with peers and resolve issues. Yes, important skill. Teamwork, understanding different perspectives, listening to each other, active listening. Communication, effective communication, absolutely. Relationship with teachers and peers. And there's where we're coming back to having a sense of belonging. And if you feel safe, you can have effective communication. And if we model this as adults, then that we have a really healthy way forward, where children feel like they can openly share what is going on in themselves. So how do we spot mental ill health? So, you know, there are physical and behavioral symptoms. So, you know, when you're surviving, you have changes in your sleep. You might not be able to sleep, or you sleep for such a long time that you can't get up. The appetite changes. You know, you might just be binge eating, or you can't eat anything. personal hygiene. You know, you can either get obsessive or you go the other way of not really washing because you just can't be bothered anymore. Headaches, stomach aches, other aches, you know, your whole nervous system is communicating discomfort. You know, if you're struggling, it's hard to focus, hard to focus. You can't communicate very well, you know, decision fatigue, making decisions is exhausting, especially when, you know, you're in the teaching profession and you have to teach and make so many decisions all day long. So you can see how the teaching profession is actually, you know, sending people into, or, you know, it could be easy to send people into the struggling mode. You know, there's so many factors that play into it. That's why it's really important that we look out for the teachers and the teaching assistants, but the teachers' workload is immense. So there's a huge amount of compassion that needs to be shared, and we've got to find a way to look after each other. And then in crisis, spotting signs of self-harm and psychosis. So these are the things that we need to keep an eye out. These are the physical symptoms. Then we have behavioral symptoms, where we have a lack of motivation when you're surviving. You know, you can't be bothered completing any tasks. The routine changes, things, you know, good habits that were in place that might just disappear. And then, you know, not turning up and being more irritable, you know, thin-skinned. I mean, we have a huge amount of young people who are not coming to school, you know, emotionally based school avoidance, that's called. So, you know, let's recognize that they're surviving. And surviving means we need, you know, support from our wider network. And, you know, we could start introducing professional support. Struggling, increased impulsivity, risk-taking behaviors, increased alcohol intake. Yeah, I mean, we all know that feeling of when we're exhausted, a glass of wine seems like a really good idea. But also there's a slippery slope. You know, if we're really struggling, if that's like a daily thing, then that's something that needs to be looked at.
Okay.
And then mentioning suicidal thoughts and extreme emotional outbursts. So at Yes Scholar Mentoring, we have seen children with extreme emotional outbursts. So what does this? This tells us that they're in crisis. So instead of like putting a punishment onto someone who's in crisis, it's really thinking about how can we get them into, you know, level up, you know, which is that they're only struggling, and how do we regulate them up to, you know, surviving, and then that they can actually be thriving again. So it's really important to think about those different steps. So are there any other signs that you can see in behaviors with school teachers or students alike? It's just good to reflect and think about it. What might be the signs, you know? There might be a change in academic performance, you know, social withdrawal, if they've been like really well integrated within a group and then suddenly they're not really part of a group anymore. Exhaustion. Yeah, irritability, shutting down. Absolutely. So I think as long as we make sure that we understand these as a mental health or mental ill health sign, I think that takes away the judgment and the reactivity that we sometimes get, you know, because we want to protect ourselves. Once we notice that, we can approach people in a much more different way. We can actually approach them in a helpful way. We can respond rather than react. Just see. Oh, yes, I have some scenarios here. Let's see, is that the right one? So here we have a few behavior patterns, you know. for students, for example, a sudden drop of academic performance, you know, high performing students, and then suddenly their grades drop. Moving away from their peers, as I've mentioned before, constantly complaining about aches and pains, you know, like something's just not right. But I think that's them communicating their whole nervous system is dysregulated. That's something I can talk about like another time, about the whole nervous system and how it reacts to our you know, like how our body and our mind work together. You know, school avoidance, anger outbursts, we've mentioned that as well. That would be like in crisis. You know, if the appearance is changing, the hygiene, risk-taking behaviors, being overly perfectionist, or avoiding the work, both rooted in the same anxiety. Overwhelm. So again, shutting down, you know, everything is too much, nothing is right. It's just, yeah, let's keep spotting those behaviors and name them for what they are, you know, which is a mental health struggle. In staff, again, it's also absences and late arrivals, not really prepared for any sessions, lessons, can't keep up with the workload, staying away from, you know, groups, like staying away from the staff room, maybe, you know, just avoiding other people, extremely exhausted, work anxiety, being emotionally reactive, but also they're not being able to show up properly for the children they are working with. So, you know, noticeable weight changes and just feeling burnt out. You know, I've been there. I have been there a few years ago. So that's why it's really important to me that we talk about the mental health first aid, because sometimes it's easy to even not recognize that within ourselves. But I think once we bring that information to our forefront and really notice things, what's going on within ourselves, we can actually take preventative measures. You know, we can name it to tame it. Right, I think let's move on to how to help someone in the crisis. I think what's important to know is if we're not mental health professionals, we're not mental health professionals, we cannot do the help in a crisis. We can intervene, we can support, we can make sure that they're safe whilst keeping ourselves safe. But it's important to phone 999 if you notice a risk to their own or someone else's safety. I think that's like the top priority. Just remember that. If that's not the case, then there are other numbers that you can contact in order to get support. When I went through my crisis, when I had my burnout, I got help from Mind, and it was extremely useful. And I got another support, which was like talking therapy for 6 weeks, all through my GP. I phoned up the GP. I was in tears. They said, like, hang on, Lisa, this doesn't sound like you. And they helped me out. No end. I got my support. I was able to talk things through. And, you know, with being able to talk things through, I then was able to, you know, not be flat on the ground, because I was flat on the ground. I was like rock bottom. I could not pick myself up. It was even too exhausting to actually lift up the phone to ask for help. But I got it in the end. And being able to talk things through helped me to actually sit up so I could actually prop myself back up again and start implementing all the changes and habits that support me in my mental health. So I think it's very important to recognize the different signs. Then I have a few other scenarios of how we can help students in a crisis. So you have a student who expresses feeling overwhelmed and mentions not wanting to be here. So in a one-to-one conversation, you have someone in secondary school who mentions that they're feeling overwhelmed. Yeah. Sometimes I just don't want to be here anymore. They seem withdrawn and defeated. What's something you could do in that situation? Really think about it. How would you respond to the student? Would you have follow-up questions? Would you clarify their feelings? And then what resources would you give them? You know, just kind of, think about the numbers that are on the slide. I'm looking over here. I have a different screen where I have my slides. So really think about that. You have a student who shows self-harm marks. What do? You ask the student, and then what? They're not going to say, oh yeah, have a look. They will pull away, say it's nothing, or they come up with an excuse. So how would you approach that discussion? What communication would you use? How aware are you of your judgments in your language as you communicate? What is your effective way of communicating this? How could you get professional help for the student and that they are also able to access it? You have a student that has an anxiety attack during an exam. It's normal or okay to feel this way. I would talk about no leading questions. I would talk to the safeguarding team. Yeah, important. And again, yes, normalizing, validating the feelings. There's nothing wrong with them. If you're struggling, you're struggling, and it's important to validate that. It's their reality, and we mustn't take away their reality. But we can support them through it, and we can support their way out of it, and exactly getting some professionals on board. Talk to the school nurse, counselor, and find service that are on offer. Yeah, absolutely. So, because these are children and young people who are in crisis then, so you definitely need professional help. I agree. So when we look at our colleagues and how we can support them, I have a few scenarios here as well. I'm not going to do all of them because I think, it's been a lot of information now. So, you have a teacher that shows signs of burnout and talks about quitting. What would you do? Just a little bit close to home, eh? But, if you have a teacher who mentions being completely burnt out and they don't know how much longer they can do this, and they're extremely exhausted and they've been communicating it, how can you at your school support that teacher? What are the steps you have in place to give a teacher the break they need, the support they need? What is your backup plan? Because, frankly, it's hard to lose teachers and then getting a new teacher in, and then, all the new relationships need to be built. It's so important that we look after the people in our schools and our settings, that they stay, that they want to stay, that they want to be thriving. And we look at ways of reducing workload, support them with behavior issues. Yes, absolutely. Because, there are situations where we need the support and the backup, and the workload is one of the top things for any teacher. You have a teacher who frequently is absent and seems overwhelmed. Maybe they have other responsibilities outside of teaching. How would you respond? They can't come in, they can't show up for their class. Yes, it is frustrating, but how do we deal with that in a compassionate way? and what are the steps and proactive ways to find a solution. So there are a few scenarios to think about. I'm sure you can come up with some other ideas of what happens in school, you know, what scenarios might pop up for students, for teachers alike. I would recommend to sit down as a team and really think about how you can improve steps and how you can like create a system that supports each member of the team if there's a crisis. We all need a crisis backup plan. And this is the end of this webinar. So I would like to know, what did you get from it? What have you learned? What are you taking away from this? Well, whilst you're typing, I'm just going to conclude this. And I just want to thank you for attending, or if you're watching the recording, thank you for watching the recording. Share your thoughts online, send me a direct email, any reflections you have, any questions that you have. And yes, this was like the first step of what Jaskula Mentoring offers in the 1 year whole year support package for schools, where we are looking at how to support staff's mental health and young people's mental health, children's mental health, in order to have a long-term plan of reducing struggles of behavior, reducing the risk of exclusion at schools, and keep retaining the staff that you have, keep building on top of the relationships that you already have with the students. So our long 1 year offer offers exactly that. Thank you for making me think about my own well-being and my son's as a teacher and mother of teenage boys. It's good to hear the signs to look out for. Well, thank you very much. It's something that I've learned after I hit rock bottoms. It's always important that we learn these things before we get there. Absolutely. I'm going to stop. Thank you very much. This is my clock. Birds singing in the background.